With the recent patch in the Cycle Frontier for patch 3.3, we received a few changes to the mob aggression system. And when I read the patch notes, I thought to myself, what do we actually know about how the creatures behave in this game? What kind of data is there to see how they behave, and what kind of effect will the changes have on them after the patch goes live? I say after because luckily I read the patch notes before the game went down for maintenance. So armed with a whole 30 minutes before the shutdown, I jumped into a raid to gather some data to compare before and after the patch. If you just wanted a yay or nay kind of answer, it's pretty funny, so leave a like on the video before you click out of here, because there's basically no difference. There's two changes. One being that the bushes now affect creature line of sight, and mobs de-aggro if you can gap them around 50 meters, which feels like the bug that they've now fixed. Besides that, it's the same. So it's some good and bad changes in my opinion. But if you were interested in a more in-depth explanation of how mobs behave, what triggers them, and possible fixes, then I've got you covered with the rest of the video. Alright, so to get into the creature behavior, we have to start at the beginning, with the 4 basic states a creature can be in: resting, idle, investigative, and aggressive. Let's take our little Strider to begin with. This is our little doggy in his resting state. His idle state is where he basically just aimlessly walks around. In the investigative state, he starts to get a bit of a pep in his step, hunting around, and then his aggressive state will start with a couple of barks before charging at the target. A Strider will be in either the idle or resting state until something happens inside of one of the 2 radiuses surrounding it. The 2 radiuses are the investigative radius and the aggression radius, where if something creates a noise inside of the investigative radius, it will go into the investigative state. For aggression to trigger, a target has to be inside of the aggression radius, and the Strider has to have line of sight on the target. The distance for the radiuses that I have mentioned is 30 meters for the investigation, 25 meters for the aggression. At this point you might be wondering how you can test this, as there's really nothing in the game to show you exact distance, but the native scopes of the Basilisk and the Arbiter actually have a rangefinder built in. Luckily for me, the 8x scope also has this feature, so I don't actually have to walk around with hundreds of thousands of K marks, literally just staring at mobs crouch walking towards them in the middle of just the open everywhere. Unfortunately though, the rangefinder is basically broken, with the distances seemingly to only show when aiming at certain objects. Mobs not included in those objects. So I had to aim at their feet to get an actual distance to the mob. So in the 30 minutes I had, I was able to get info on the normal Striders, Rattlers, and Marauders. So their upgraded versions, Crushers, Ticks, and the Howler are not tested in this video, and I can't comment on their data. But what we can comment on is all of the testing we can do around those 2 radiuses. So first off, how I tested this was with my C32 Bolty, 8x equipped, staring at their feet and walking towards it. You can see here the Strider transitions into the investigative state at 30 meters, and once it crosses that 25 meter threshold, it moves into the aggression state. This is the data for before and after the patch for 3.3, the Striders and also Rattlers. For Marauders, however, we have an investigative state radius of 40 meters, but the aggression radius stays the same as the other mobs at 25 meters. Some important information to know for when a mob transitions from investigative to aggression is the line of sight. A creature has to have line of sight on its target before it can become aggressive, and that a creature's line of sight is not 360 degrees. They have a cone-based vision, which is why you are able to trigger the investigative state and run past it like this. Alright, so we've got the basics down. Let's come up with a list of tests that can give us some conclusive data to compare. So we've got the basic tests of the radius ranges, going to be doing that for walking and crouching. We can also test how far outside of the ranges we can make louder noises like sprinting and shooting before we trigger the investigative and or aggression states. Another thing we can test is shooting past mobs and next to them to see how that affects them. Lastly, we can test this group vision thing that they've stated in the patch notes. All of these tests probably aren't absolutely everything, but it's all I could think of in the time I had to give us some conclusive data on any changes implemented. If you can think of anything else that would help, please comment down below on what it might be. Alright, so for all of these tests, the Rattler performed the exact same as the Strider. So we're just going to be removing that column entirely and focusing on Striders and Marauders for this video. Okay, testing the ranges. The Strider's 2 radiuses tested for both walking and crouching saw no difference in distance for either before or after the patch, with the Investigative at 30 and Aggro at 25 meters. For the Marauders, it's the same as well, with a 40 meter Investigative range and 25 meter Aggression range, both before and after the patch. Moving on to making noise outside of the Investigative range, this is probably the dumbest part to me because you can be literally 1 meter outside of the Investigative radius and make as much noise as you want, shoot, sprint, jump, it really doesn't matter because nothing is going to happen until you cross that threshold. And this was the same for both before and after the patch. Something else I wanted to test was about having stray shots going past creatures and how that would affect the mobs. So I tried it, and shooting past a creature has absolutely no effect on it whatsoever unless the bullet lands close to where the creature is. And even then there is a range for at which it affects it and what it does. So if we look at this Marauder here, we can actually make it move around by shooting close to it like this. How this works is by having the bullet impact the ground within the creature's Investigative radius, which triggers it as if there was a player inside of the range. So it sets out to search for a player to become aggressive on. Here you can see I can shoot the ground outside of the 40 meter radius of the Marauder and nothing happens. But if I shoot inside of the 40 meters, it triggers the Investigative state. But because there's no one there, it won't transition into the Aggression state. From my testing, there is absolutely zero change from either before or after the patch with this test. Alright, last thing, the group vision. So I had a theory on this when I read it, and with only 30 minutes to test things before maintenance, it was a little hard to get exactly what I wanted out of it, but I think I managed to get enough information to properly corroborate my theory. So with the last test, we saw that anything that happens inside of a creature's investigation radius would trigger it. So using this information, I figured the same would be true for the shared group vision thing. And that appears to be the case. If we have 2 Striders over 10 meters apart, one well outside of the radius to you and the other within, then it gives the other aggression as well when the first one becomes aggressive towards you, even though you are outside of its radiuses. But if we have Striders over 30 meters apart and make one aggressive, the other does not. But something I did not expect is that if you had a Strider chasing you with aggression and run past another Strider from a different mob pack, but do not enter the 25 meter aggression radius for the other mob pack Strider, then that Strider will only ever enter into the Investigative state, even if the aggressive Strider runs past it. So they don't actually share group vision like that. I believe this to be the case because creatures can only share the group vision with other creatures that it has spawned with and not with all creatures in the game. And I tested that theory to be true. So I grabbed this Strider here and he's obviously aggressive towards me and he runs within 30 meters of the other group of Striders by the hut. All Striders spawned inside of the Woodcutter camp but did not spawn together. So there's 3 Striders that can spawn up by this little hut here. This Strider spawns by himself down towards the river here a little bit more. I shoot a few rounds to try to lure the other group of Striders close, and it's not until those Striders are within the aggression distance of myself that they transition to that state, disregarding the already aggressive Strider entirely. And this was the exact same for both before and after the patch. It's worth noting that the creature's resting state has an effect on how close you can get to it, but this is the same before and after the patch. I was never able to get an actual distance on it, just due to the time nature, and the majority of resting Striders I came across were in packs already, so the group vision came into effect here. So far, everything I've tested has been the exact same. and nothing's changed. So you might be thinking, what has actually changed then? What was the point of this patch? And well, from everything I've tested, there are actually a total of 2 differences. Unfortunately, neither of these things were something I thought to test within the 30-minute window I had, but they are such an obvious change that it is actually different before and after the patch. So first of all, bushes are now considered when determining a line of sight for a creature. Think of the bush like a big box. If you are inside of the box, the creature only sees the box. You can shoot and run around and make as much noise inside of the box as you want, because the creature's not going to have line of sight on you. But if you were to step outside of the box for just a millisecond, the creature will latch onto you and become aggressive. You can see this here as I was testing it, where I jumped and my head quickly just popped out over the bush outside of our theoretical box, causing the Strider to become aggressive. The speed at which creatures become aggressive to you is insanely fast when looking in your direction, and all they need to do is see a single pixel for a microsecond and you are done. I tested this change using the bush as a barrier between myself and the Strider to see if the creature took into account the bush as a solid object or treated it more like camouflage for the player, and you can see that they treat the bush as a solid object, and you are actually able to skirt around creatures if you were to keep a bush between you and them at all times. Alright, so the next change comes with the confirmation of another mechanic to have not changed. So we're looking at creature roam and leashing ranges. A roam range is the maximum range at which a creature will follow you before de-aggroing and resetting back to its original location, and a leash range is the range at which a creature will stay aggressive towards its target before de-aggroing and resetting. So prior to the patch, the leash range was infinite. The only limiting factor was the roam range of the mob. Most commonly set at the edges of areas. Think of how when you enter somewhere like the East Collection Point, you get a little boom sound and a pop-up shows up on your screen. After the patch, the roam ranges of creatures are exactly the same. But what has changed is that the creature leash range now seems to actually be in effect at around 50 meters. Because of the speed of mobs in the game, it was actually quite hard to determine the exact distance as I'm trying to run around, jump, do a 180 and check to see the state of the creature on me. But I'm very confident that it is now set to 50 meters. And that's it, just 2 changes. I'd honestly say that the leash range was the bug that they were talking about, and it was causing a lot of the aggression changes to feel very weird. So the only actual change I think has been implemented was the bush, which I think is an absolutely piss poor change. You can quite literally just camp in a bush without any repercussions whatsoever, empowering a rat-like playstyle even further. Something the community has very loudly stated that they are against, and yet here we are. But let me know what you think about the changes to the creature aggros in the game down below in the comments. How does it feel for you? Do you think it's better or worse? And what do you think should be done to further better the state of mobs in the Cycler Frontier? For me, I think the investigation radius for all mobs should be lowered by 5 meters and the aggression radius by 10, and then implement a system that takes into account player visibility for the creature. So how much of the player can the creature actually see before determining if that creature then can transition into an aggression state. Basically a sliding scale of mob sees 100% of player, then mob can become aggressive at maximum aggression radius, all the way down to if mob sees 1% of player, then the mob becomes aggressive towards the player at 3 to 5 meters. And 0%, obviously no aggression state. This should be implemented while changing the amount a bush counts for player obscurity to the range of around 50%. Situations like this should not happen. But yeah, that's the current state of creatures in the Cycler Frontier. I wish I had more time to test more things, but this was all that I was able to get to with the limited time I had. I quite literally stayed until the last possible second, so hit that like button and sub to the channel for more guides and gameplay, and I'll see you in the next one.